Okay, so welcome to another interview by myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, for A Tippling Philosopher. I write at Patheos Non-Religious Network at A Tippling Philosopher. That's my blog name. I look a little bit odd at the moment, as I've said in the last few interviews, because I have cannulas and catheters coming out of my neck because I have primary progressive multiple sclerosis, and I'm presently in isolation in a clinic in Russia, receiving stem cell treatment and chemotherapy to make myself better. It's not a gulag. I'm in a really wonderful place and I'm receiving fantastic treatment. But today's guest, Jack Matirko, is someone who I have come across several times before by being on his very own podcast, Naked Dino, a couple of times, which I've really, really enjoyed. And he is a Satanist, and I thought that would be a really interesting guest to have on to talk about before we go off on many tangents, as I'm sure we will. So, Jack, did you want to just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself, to plug away at whatever you want to.
Yeah, I think, if I remember right, I tried looking it up, that I think the first time you were on our podcast was like 3 years ago. For your book Metamorphosis. And back then, I don't even think I was involved in the Satanic Temple stuff. I was still just doing, atheist, secular, humanist activism type stuff. And then TST started to get bigger. I found out about them. And I guess I had already been aware of
what's TST
was doing. The Satanic Temple.
Right.
Which is the organization that I throw my cards in with, There's a bunch of other ones, but they're the ones that seem to be doing all the stuff that's more or less in line with what I think needs to get done and what should be being done. So I tossed my hat in that ring. And then...
Okay, before you go, I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you say things that should be being done, what do you mean by that?
Well, one of the things that's very big in the Satanic Temple is this idea of... activism as the religion's devotional practice. So there's things we think that need to be changed in government. We all agree on what those things are, and we do stuff to try and further those goals.
So very much it's an activist-based organization rather than just a kind of pastoral hobby.
Well, no, I mean, and just to get it out of the way, right? I'm just a drudgeon in the organization. I don't speak for it or anything like that. I'm only talking for myself. But promoting change is a big part of Satanism as a religion, right? It is right. Rebellion against authority is part of Satan's deal, So
in that, because modern Satanism appears to me, at least my understanding is that it has very little to do with an actual belief in the devil or Satan.
No, it has nothing to do with that.
Mythical, symbolic ideal, but that you can take aspects from that to apply to your life. In other words, Satan rebelled supposedly against God, so therefore there's a rebellious nature maybe against authority, but perhaps for beneficial change rather than for just being dastardly.
Right. Yeah. No. It's a lot. I've been thinking about it a bit, where it's kind of like how Thomas Jefferson was a Christian, right? Because he went through the Bible and he cut out all the metaphysical stuff and he cut out all the divinity stuff, and he's just like, here's a story about a guy who I think was a pretty good guy, and I think in Satanism in the same way takes, the cultural milieu of stories about Satan and the devil and say, well, look, there's some good stuff in here, and if we interpret this story the right way, then maybe he's not such a bad guy in this story, and maybe this omnipotent celestial dictator is the problem.
Well, yeah, because you've got the book of Job where, Satan is having this kind of deal with God, and it's almost as if Satan comes off a bit nicer than God, as far as I remember it.
Yeah, and my favorite one is, there's two that are my favorites, and those are Genesis stuff, where you know, you've got the snake in the garden with Adam and Eve, and the snake's like, eat this fruit, you'll get knowledge. And she's like, well, what's wrong with knowledge? Hang on, let's back up here. Why doesn't God want the people to have knowledge?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So what would you say? Okay, so if you're saying some kind of activism, some kind of rebellion against authority, what would you say are the moral tenets of Satanism? I mean, where would you get your morality from? Is it something that's innate and natural, or do you take it from some other source, such as many Christians would take it from the Bible?
Well, I think that varies depending on what flavor of Satanism you're talking about, right? Like in the Satanic Temple, they've got the 7 tenets, which are seven very, I think, pretty obvious humanist values, right? You know, your body is yours. You can do what you want with it. You can offend people, but they're allowed to offend you back, that kind of stuff, right? So a lot of it boils down to just basic humanist principles. Just putting this kind of mythology over top of it.
Yeah. Well, which actually leads me on to, there are many claims that Satanism is quite closely aligned to libertarianism. I mean, there are some libertarians who wouldn't proclaim themselves to be Satanists, you know, Ayn Rand and H.L. Mencken and people like that, but whose philosophies are quite aligned to those of Satanists. Would that be correct in saying?
Oh, I think the Satanists that I know are pretty broad on the political spectrum. I see what you're saying about libertarianism. There's definitely that contingent of Satanists who are very much anti-government, but I think there's also a very left-leaning contingent that it's not so much that their problems with authority, their problem is with arbitrary authority. And someone saying, you know, well, I get to do this because I'm in this position. And it's just like, well, yeah, but we gave you that position on the basis that you would do the right thing, and now you're doing the wrong thing, you know?
So do you think in that respect, it's actually quite similar to secularism? I mean, does Satanism play a part in trying to secularize what is ostensibly a secular country that America is, but in all but name, because in reality it is far less secular than Britain,
right?
Which is technically not a secular country. So does Satanism play a part in that?
Yeah, I think the line that organizations like the Satanic Temple are trying to draw is there's this weird right-wing component, at least in the United States. There's a right-wing component to the secular movement in the United States that wants to eliminate religion altogether. And I think Satanists are coming at this from an angle of, well, look, you can't eliminate. I mean, freedom of religion is freedom of religion, right? You're allowed to have that religion. You can't just start outlawing religion. So if we're going to have a truly pluralist society, then we need to be accepting of all religions. And the one thing that Satanism does very well is when Christian theocrats come in and try and start changing laws to suit them, having this other religion there that can come in and say, well, if you get to do that, we get to do that too, really shakes them up, because they don't want to, you know, cede that space in the public square that they're trying to take for themselves.
That logical symmetry, isn't it? But I suppose what you're up against are the biases that people have against Satanism, because they don't understand Satanism in the kind of modern, I suppose, atheistic sort of way. They see it as the old school devil worshipping manner, which will taint your good actions and your good virtues.
It was never really a thing. A lot of that was a smear against the Freemasons, if you go back to, you know, France in the 1800s, right? So it doesn't really seem to be the case that Satanism ever was that it was all a propaganda campaign against anyone who they decided that they wanted to demonize.
Well, yeah, it sort of gets messed up with the occult. Doesn't
Yeah.
it really? Yeah. And then when you look at, I remember watching, was it Paradise Lost, the 3-part series about those kids that supposedly murdered some other kids, and they were done for being sort of Satanists, but it was all just a load of bunker. But you know, it's throwing those cultural myths of Satanism over these people in a completely indiscriminate and unfair way.
Right. Well, that's the history of Satan, right? Like if you look at the way the characters evolved from those very few mentions in the Bible, right? There's not a whole lot about that character in that book, but there's all this other cultural stuff, right? This idea, that Satan is this giant, brooding, winged thing with horns, right? Well, that's not Satan. Like if you watch Fantasia, the Hall of the Mountain King part, right? They've got this big blue demon thing, and everybody's just like, well, that's Satan. And it's just, no, it's not. It's some Ukrainian deity, because the guy who put that together was just digging back into his own cultural heritage, right? Yeah. And so what happened was, as the Christian church moved in and took over more and more of the world, every pagan religion out there, all of their gods got lumped into and mashed into this character that people think of as Satan. So it's this weird, amorphous, multicultural thing as a character.
And I think you can say that largely about Christianity as a whole and the theology that goes with it, because heaven and hell, which are such central tenets to the theology of Christianity, are offered very little page, time in the Bible, so that really people are creating post hoc sort of ideas of what heaven and hell must or might be.
Everyone's modern conception of hell is Dante's Inferno.
Yeah, exactly. And you get annihilationists who say, well, hell is just an annihilation of your soul and it's nothingness. And then you get, it's the boiling of bodies, it's this and that. I remember going into a cathedral in France, in Albi, and it was quite incredible, lovely big cathedral. And you can imagine being a French illiterate peasant. And at the bottom third of the whole of the side at the end of the church was this artwork of hell, of boiling bodies of these beasts just dismembering. It was just disgusting. And then the middle part was normal life, and then the top part was heaven. And you can imagine this is perfect propaganda. You can't speak the language. You go in, you're like, well, if I don't believe, that's where I'm going to end up. This is where I live at the moment, and if I do believe, all of that lovely stuff up there. But actually, where is the veracity of that from the actual Bible?
It's not there.
Yeah, there you go.
And on the other side, well, the other thing about that is that anyone who proclaimed some faith other than that one got automatically thrown in with the people who are going to hell, right? Yeah. So one of Lucian Greaves, the co-founder of TST, I want to say he gave a talk at a American Atheist sometime, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago, where he pointed out that, like, look, these people already think you're a devil worshiper because you're an atheist, right? They come up with all their weird little slogans, and they're just like, well, the devil's just tricking you to believe that God's not there, and you really do. You just don't know it. And, yeah. So a lot of the point of Satanism is, look, they're labeling it to you. You may as well own it.
Yeah,
go with it, right?
You're going 50 on the motorway here. Let's just crank it up to 80, and let's just the whole hog. Yeah. So have you been involved in any of these sort of? Because I quite like the idea, and you mentioned this earlier. It's like if you're going to put the 10 Commandments here in this technically secular area, where on the side of maybe a law building, we're going to stick a big statue of whoever it is, because we've got just as much logical right to do that.
Yeah.
And they do that. Have you been involved in any of those sort of things? Are you broadly in support of
we haven't actually mentioned yet. I blog over at Pathos too.
Yeah, of
on
course.
internal use only. Covering all of this stuff. So I've been bouncing around the country for the last 2 years trying to keep up. It's actually funny because the Satanic Temple's got this documentary coming out about them, Hail Satan. And it was a really weird movie to watch and review because I was in so many of the same places as the filmmakers. Like we hung out a bunch just bouncing around the country together the last couple of years. And so watching the movie was strange because I saw all the same stuff they did. And I'm just like, I wonder why they cut that out. I wonder why they left this bit. Just like, I know there was this thing that happened that they didn't talk about. That's weird. So it was a really strange experience. But yeah, I've been following TST around. I work with my local Arizona chapter, and we do, well, right now our chapter is suing the city of Scottsdale, Arizona, because they wouldn't let our chapter head give an invocation at their city council meeting.
Right.
We do a collection drive where we collect menstrual products for underserved women in the community. Because for charity drives, that's a thing that doesn't really come up very much. People don't like to think about it. So, you know, people will donate food and they'll donate clothing and stuff, but they never think to donate tampons. So we do a collection drive for that.
Well, actually, that's really interesting because if it's about winning hearts and minds, which I suppose to some extent it is, I mean, you need to be seen. You don't want to be seen as the enemy, right? So is charity work and real good moral actions and work that you do, is that a really important part of what you're about?
Yeah, I think it is. I think we spend more time doing that, like as chapters, because the stuff that makes it really into the news is when the national organization is doing something big, like trying to put a Baphomet statue in Arkansas or suing Missouri over abortion laws or something like that. But the state level chapters do a lot of smaller charity work. Like just this month alone, Colorado is doing a collection drive for veterans. There's a chapter in Minnesota that's doing a collection drive for like baby stuff for new mothers who are below the poverty line. A few of us have adopt-a-highways and adopt-a-beaches and stuff like that.
So that, I mean, but that's the sort of stuff where you really need media on your side because, you know, best will in the world, the media are going to absolutely love reporting you trying to sue a town to try and get some statue up because that's really controversial and that's going to piss people off. But when you're going around being really nice and saying, look, here's a bunch of menstrual stuff for you because you don't have it, they're going to be like, yeah, whatever. So I suppose...
Well, they do until you stick a pentagram with a goat head on it, and then they're like, what's going on? This is weird. So
Fair enough. So the image of Satanism, I think, is also an interesting thing. Like I've talked about virtue signaling before because my opinion is that literally every human being on earth virtue signals the whole time, right? What you wear, what you say, how you comport yourself to other people is a way of saying this is who I am. And I'm wearing this hat because I want this image. I'm saying these things because I want you to know I'm this kind of person. In the same way that Satanists have a very clear image to what they wear. Is that an important way of signaling who you are and your virtues? What do you think that does for you?
I mean, I think in terms of like fashion and aesthetic, there's something there, but a lot of it, I think that like the darker stuff is generally a reflection of knowing that we're the underdog, right? And it's just kind of, okay, there's this idea that, in order to be good and moral, you need, you need the women modestly dressed and the men bespoke and white picket fences and all of that. And we're just, no, you can be a good person and still, dress however you want and do whatever you want. And if my style of dress is what's bothering you, and otherwise we get along, then there's an issue there, right?
That's your intolerance and not mine. Yeah. So are there any other aspects of Satanism that you think are interesting that viewers would like to know or would need to know in order to get a better understanding of who you are and what you do?
I mean, maybe, but I don't know how concise I could be. You know, I do think pieces on the blog every once in a while where I try and delve into some of this stuff, like why I think that this story is the one that matters. And
so what ritually do you do? I mean, so say a Sunday church going Christian would go to church on Sunday and other days maybe and do masses and do this. Is there any kind of ritualistic participation that you take part in, and if so, why?
Oh yeah, well, in a lot of senses, the collection drives and charity stuff we would call a ritual in and of itself, right?
What a much more useful ritual, by the way, than standing and worshipping.
But we also get into psychodrama a bit. It's really very ad hoc. Like it's not. Because individualism is so intrinsic to the idea, there's no set prescription for rituals. There's a couple, okay, these are ones that other people have done before, take them and make them your own kind of things that go on. There was just a thing the other week where the Satanic Temple's Grey Faction, which is a kind of a side group that tries to combat pseudoscience in psychology, they're opposed to dissociative identity disorder treatment, which is a whole other thing. Yeah. But they did basically a media campaign where a bunch of the chapters got together and they all did the same ritual, which was just kind of a symbolic destruction of this one psychologist's license because they know she's a quack, and they're just like, we want her out, and we are doing this because we're setting our sights. It's almost like before a high school football game where the one team will burn the other team's mascot in effigy, right? It's just to psych yourself up for the game because
yeah. So who gets to decide? I mean, is there any kind of hierarchy where you get to decide what kind of campaigns you're going to do, or is it very much a togetherness sort of democratic approach? Do you have a hierarchical structure in your temple or set or?
Okay, so you were asking about the hierarchy. Yeah, there is a little. Basically, the idea is you can do whatever you want, but if you want to put TST's name on it, you have to go through the proper channels to get it approved.
Yeah.
And you're frozen up again. Oh, did you get that?
Yeah, I've got that.
Okay. Yeah, so for example, like it's not like I have to go through some approval process for my blog or anything like that. But if, I wanted to go out and do something, I could say I'm doing something. If the chapter that I work with wants to do something, then we have to fill out a form and tell the national organization's organizers, hey, this is what we want to do, just to make sure that, it's consistent and on brand and,
Yeah. So there is some kind of accountability. It's not just a free-for-all for everyone. Cool.
No, but they're pretty understanding. As long as you make your case and say, look, this is the thing I want to do, and here's why I think it fits, and here's how I think, it's relevant to TST and what they're doing. More often than not, they'll let people do stuff.
Yeah.
As long as the idea is good and you can explain it,
And what are the growth numbers, or are there growth numbers for adherence to Satanism around America?
I hear a bunch of different numbers. I guess the Satanic Temple's Facebook group has maybe 50,000 people in it. I think they say that they've got maybe 100,000 people worldwide who are at least say that they're a member at some point or another. But people come in and out like anything else.
Yeah, of course. So you would say it's in some sort of fairly healthy place at the moment, and it's having some impact on society in, for example, America.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely having an effect. Like if you look at one of the lesser known monument things was this winter when the Chicago chapter put a statue of, it was just a hand with a snake wrapped around it with an apple in it, that they put in the Capitol Rotunda right next to the Christmas tree and stuff, or right next to the manger scene. And people lost their minds over this, but it makes people have that discussion and say, okay, if we're going to allow religious stuff here, we have to allow all the religious stuff here. So that means the Satanist stuff has to go in too.
Yeah. And it's that logical analogy that you catch people out on, because, you know, otherwise it's double standards, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting introduction into Satanism, and I'm sure there's absolutely heaps more that you could say about that. What are some of the projects you're involved in at the moment that may or may not be connected to that?
Yeah, well, the Naked Diner obviously is not Satan-centric in and of itself. It's me and my co-host Andy Hall, who also writes for Pathos with us.
Yeah.
And we're all on the non-religious channel, so we're talking more often than not. We're talking to atheists about something, but we'll also talk to comedians, and it's more of our. We just want to talk to people about. We just want to talk to interesting people, and we're not picky about who those people are.
I know you're not picky. You've had me on there twice.
Yeah, so that show's been going over 3 years now, and we do pretty well on there, I think. So we do an hour-long interview with just about anybody we can get our hands on, musicians, comedians, authors. It's fun. And then I just started 2 new other podcasts. I started one called Ex Libris Obscura, which is just me talking about books that I don't think get enough attention.
Right.
So like I started that one the other week with its first episode. I talked about Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail in 1972.
Right.
Because I think that is a particularly relevant book right now.
In what sense? Is it pressing?
Well, Hunter S. Thompson was a weird guy, but one thing he did very well was when he was following politics was he would go in and not just cover, okay, this happened, but why that happened, the journalists' impressions of what was going on, the mood of the people. And in 1972, that's when Nixon won re-election. And I think that Nixon won re-election in 72 with 49 states. And I think all these people who are looking at what's going on in the Democratic primaries here right now are missing this, what happened in 1972, which there was a bunch of people who had very different ideologies running for the Democratic nomination, and they beat the hell out of each other so much that Nixon just walked into re-election. And I'm really worried that that's something that could happen here next year, you know?
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because there's a couple of things I've been seeing recently. I mean, Jesus, like I'm interested outside of religion in 2 big things at the moment. Brexit in the UK, but we can forget that because that's just a shitstorm. But the bigger shitstorm is American politics, which is so divisive, so controlled by lobbying, so polarized. And we have this situation where the midterms were actually really, really good. People underwrote them at the time, but actually in hindsight, it was a bit of a blue wave. But I'm worried about Trump 2020 because with so many candidates vying on the Democratic front with fairly different remits and ages and genders and appeals that you wonder whether that same thing will happen and Trump will end up just marching through on his core base again.
Yeah, well, that's what happened in 72. Like, if you read that book and follow what happened through that campaign, you had this far left candidate who had lost the nomination in 68, which caused riots at the DNC in 1968. And he had lost it. He was running again. And there was the former Democratic vice president who was kind of the establishment candidate. And eventually, the far left candidate got the nomination. But by then, everyone had trash talked each other so hard that all Nixon had to do was just take all the talking points from all those other people who had beaten on him for, 8 months and just throw those back out there. And
it's like the classics of what Bill Clinton did, which was focus groups. Go around, find out what people want, and then say, yeah, that's what I'll do. And then he gets all those swing voters, and then job done. I mean, the problem is you've got Bernie Sanders is probably just a little bit too old. I don't want to be ageist, but at the end of the day, I think charisma means a lot in politics now. When you're talking about, your main kind of average Joe voter. So I think you got Cortez is going to be probably too young. You've got Biden is probably just on the wrong side of the Me Too scandal at the moment or something. And strangely enough, I favour Elizabeth Warren because I really like her passion and I really like her politics and I really like her policies, but she's a woman and America appears to still be stuck in 1957 or something. But I don't really know. Okay, can you help me out here?
I mean, when I look at the people who are running right now and for the Democrats, I don't necessarily think that any of them, from my perspective, I will take. Do you need me to pause?
Just get my sleeping pills.
Oh, okay. Yeah, from my perspective, I look at the pool of candidates and I'll say, well, I'll take one of them over Trump. Whoever ends up being the nominee, fine. But what I fear is kind of like last election where people who had been Bernie supporters, they felt disenfranchised and they sat the election out and Hillary Clinton lost, I worry that with this broader pool and this kind of, difference of opinion, I really worry that people are just going to kind of break down into little tribal groups. And if their guy doesn't end up being the one, they're just going to sit it out and Trump's going to win in a walk. That's my concern. The ones who I think could pull off winning the middle, which I guess is pretty much what you have to do. You got your far left people and your far right people, and then this 45% group of unaffiliated voters. I don't know. I think I don't hate Biden, but he's from Scranton and I went to college there, so there's a bit of stuff going on there. I think Cory Booker could win the middle really well if he's very close to saying something like, I don't understand why small business isn't for universal health care. And if he says that and makes that case, I think he could really have a shot.
He's been saying quite a few things in Parliament recently, hasn't he? I've been watching a few things he's been saying, and I thought, yeah, he's on the money. Yeah.
Yeah, but I do worry again, the 1972 stuff. When you look at how Nixon re-won, it's because the far left of the Democratic Party was making this ideological purity test on Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I think now you're seeing that same kind of ideological purity test thing happen just with the environment and social reform. And I do worry that they are pushing it a bit more than the middle is willing to go along with.
But it is interesting because stats seems to suggest that universal healthcare is becoming more popular across the partisan divide. So, I think that could play into
right. But the problem is you need a way to. They never talk about it in terms of, they always talk about it in terms of the employee. They never talk about why universal healthcare would be good for the mom and pop business, or somebody who runs a business with 50 employees or whatever. You tell them, hey, okay, so we're going to give you less paperwork. It's going to save you money. And you just don't have to deal with your employees' insurance stuff anymore. And it frees up hours of your day, right?
It is cheaper than, you look at any other universal healthcare system in the world, and America spends, even though it's not universal healthcare, it seems to spend more on healthcare than anyone else in the world. So it's the same situation where, I don't know, to me, the white working class American voter who votes Republican always seem to bite off their nose to spite their face, because they seem to be single issue voters. They seem to be gun advocates or pro-life. And so therefore, if anything falls outside of those remits, it's irrelevant. I remember watching that. I said this in my last interview, actually. There's a UK politician that went to the US, and he did a series called Trump Man, where he went around interviewing Trump supporters. And he went to this black radio host who you would have thought, and I don't want to be stereotypical here, but you would have thought he was classic Democrat voter. But he was an absolute gun rights advocate. And he basically said, completely explicitly, he said, you take away my right to carry arms. You mess around with my gun rights advocacy, and you ain't got my vote. This is the only thing that matters to me. Nothing else matters. And when you have these people who are single issue voters, they're really hard to budge.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that the Republican Party has done really well in terms of building their alliance is that they seem to have part of it has to do with just an authoritarian mindset, right? So they get someone who is a single issue voter on like abortion or gun control or something like that, and they say, well, okay, you believe in this and this, and we believe in this and this, and we also believe in this, this, and this, so you must also believe in this, this, and this, right? Like they convince them that taxing the rich is bad because they don't want gun control, which is such a confusion of ideas, but it becomes so tribal so quickly.
It's almost the opposite of guilt by association. It's like, positive by association.
Yeah, exactly. They're pro-gun rights.
Yes.
The candidate is pro-gun rights, so the candidate is also.
So I think American politics is so polarized. And the other issue is, of course, that Trump appears to be immune to lying, or at least his supporters are immune to his lies. I mean, over 9,000 blatant lies now, and no one seems to give a crap. He can say anything he likes. He can do whatever he likes, and no one appears to bat an eyelid because there's that immunization that's taking place. And that's a real worry.
Yeah, it's gotten to the point that people aren't even really sure if he's lying or just straight up crazy, right? Like a couple days ago, he said he's talked about the small village his father was born in Germany. His father was born in New York City. Like, that's not even a small lie. That's just, you should know that one, right?
Yeah. And there's quite a lot of cool, and I've seen a few videos that really actually do support this quite well, to say that he's definitely got some kind of pre-dementia, or, his speech, his language, the way he comports himself, he really doesn't seem fit for office. So you're wondering in 2020 whether how that will manifest itself as well.
Yeah. Well, there's also There's some odd American history regarding that, though. Like, I mean, Andrew Jackson was crazy. There was one, I can't remember which president it was, but there was one president who he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. They got a doctor. They went out on a boat in the middle of the harbor to perform the operation, went in through the top of his mouth so there wouldn't be a scar. This was all while he was acting president. Right? They just had a letter ready in case anything wrong to go to the VP and say, you're it now.
Did it work?
Yeah, it worked. He finished his term.
Job done.
But that's crazy, right? Like that whole time this was going, he had a brain tumor. That has to raise some questions about whether or not he's, able to fulfill the job, right? But no, they just kept it quiet and didn't tell anybody.
So Trump 2020 is definitely a problem, and it looks to be a problem that's not going away. I mean, I assumed that he would just shoot himself in the foot so many times that people would go, well, this guy clearly is a complete douchebag. We can't vote him in again.
Well, the thing is, I think it's one of the problems with social media kind of filtering everybody into their own little media bubbles is that they overestimate the amount of support that they really have.
Yeah.
Right? Because this was a thing, one of the things I've been doing with the Satanic Temple stuff and the atheism stuff to an extent is I've been digging around in tax records a lot and just looking at how much money is involved, right?
So tax records.
It's ridiculous. Well, I mean, like you look at a group like American Atheists. American Atheists, as far as the atheist community is concerned, is a huge organization. They bring in about $1 million a year. You look at Alliance Defending Freedom, some far-right Christian organization, they're bringing in $50-60 million a year. Right? I don't think anybody truly grasps how out-moneyed the secular organizations are trying to fight back. Everyone in the community does amazing work with ridiculously limited resources by comparison. And I think that a lot of the far-left Democrats who are in their little Facebook groups that have, 5,000-6,000 people really think that there's a lot more support for their ideas than there actually is in the wider culture,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's absolutely true. And, you put that together with the massive lobbying, and I know lobbying takes place on both sides of the political or partisan divide, but you just think that the sheer amount of money that gets poured into these things, it's hard.
It's mind-numbing. That's one of the things that the UK does right is you guys have a set term for campaigning, right? It's like 60, 90 days or...
Yeah, so what happened with Brexit, the Leave campaign just got in trouble for overspending by something like 10% and have been taken to court and things. So yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, you guys have limits on that, and we don't have that. So it's entirely money driven. At some point I want to sit down and look at like how much money got spent on the last election and like what would happen if we spent all that money on the social programs that we're fighting for.
Yeah.
Like how much money would we save in the long run, But I don't know, business is weird here.
I remember watching Sicko, Michael Moore's documentary on healthcare.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the great scenes I remember seeing, I think it was when Hillary Clinton might have been in charge of health or whatever, but they had a stage where all the people involved in healthcare policy making were up on stage, and he put labels on top of each of the people of how much money they were lobbied by the insurance companies and the big pharmaceutical companies, and everyone was making like $800,000, $500,000, and you're thinking, this is the entirety of the policy making unit of people who are making decisions supposedly for the benefit of the health of every single member of that country, and they are getting bribed. They are getting legally bribed. This is an absolute conflict of interest, and I was just absolutely shocked.
It is. It's crazy. And on top of that, we have this idea in America of valuing work, I think, to a fault. Like, we have this idea that the job that pays more is the one that sucks most. So something like an insurance processor, where it's your job to sit on the phone and tell cancer patients that their treatment's been denied and now they owe $200,000, that is a very emotionally taxing job, and therefore it pays well. So when they talk about jobs programs and making more high-paying jobs, they want more jobs like that, which is a problem, right? We need to talk about, like, how do we make jobs that need doing, but also serve a purpose? Because one of the things that we're talking about now is, the problems with the coming automation boom and how all these, low to mid-level jobs are just going to go away. And we need to deal with the fact that those jobs aren't coming back. We need to find some other job. And so what they end up doing is making more and more regulations to make more and more paper pushing jobs. It's either that or go to war, right? Because war is a jobs program. So,
well, interestingly, last year, the Green Party in Britain, who are not probably as small as they are in Britain. We do have the Green Party MP, and there's a sort of, I don't know, 5% vote for the Green Party normally. But they came up with a consultation about moving down to a 4-day working week. Because at the end of the day, in the old days, we had 7-day working weeks, and it wasn't until the unions got involved and moved down to 6 and then 5. So we now have weekends, and we have maternity benefits, and we have all that came about from unions. People like to slag off unions, but actually, if it wasn't for unionisation, we'd be working, we'd be down the mines and at the age of 8 or whatever. So, but there's an interesting idea that if automation, and I know they talked about this in the 1800s and never really happened, but if automation is genuinely going to be something that replaces human output, then we will need to consider going down to maybe 4-day weeks. And now New Zealand, I know, have trialled this in a company or two, and there are definitely aspects of improved well-being. I mean, at the end of the day, what's the meaning of life? Do we want to just work and die, or do we want to work but to be happy and have well-being? And if we can marry those two, then surely that's
right. Well, that, and I honestly, if you look at, because, when people look at, productivity numbers and whatever, they say, well, Americans are getting more and more productive, but they're getting less and less pay. But at the same time, when they say people are being more productive, I don't know how much that's true in the average office environment. I think in the average office environment, people spend about half their time looking at Facebook. So why not just pay them twice as much and let them work for 20 hours, but make sure that they're actually working for that 20 hours, right? Seems to me that if you can get the same amount done in less time, then give them the same amount of pay for that output, and then they'll have more free time, and great.
Well, I think you'll start getting a lot of places where people will be working from home a lot more, and social media, well, not social media, but technology will allow us to do so. And I think, so I'm a teacher for most of my week, and I can see in 20 years' time, I'm just going to be in my boxer shorts with a shirt and tie on, and I'll have all my class on my computer screen, and I'll still be in bed, but I'll be teaching them. They won't know. And then, you can imagine these scenarios where technology could really, robustly change the way that we operate our working lives.
No, well, I mean, that's the way it is at my house, because I blog and podcast, and so I'm working from home. My fiance is a mortgage processor, they don't even have, they have an office, but it's just a small little building that you have to go into every once in a while for a meeting. But for the most part, she logs on from here and works from home too.
Yeah. Have you ever seen Wall-E, the Disney film?
Yeah.
Yeah, where they're all sort of just get sent up in space and they're in these chaise longs. Just you know, I can see that in like a couple of 100 years' time, where we're just so lazy. We just get like this thing here. I get my bloods taken from here. I'm asleep in the morning when I do it. They just come in, plug them in, take like 8 bloods, and then go, and then plug in an infusion. And I haven't got a clue. I reckon I could be fed through this. And this goes straight into my jugular. I mean, that'd be great. Just walk around. Someone was telling me actually the other day that she works in 911 police centre, American woman that's here. And she was saying that sometimes junkies get these at a hospital and then they leave the hospital with them still in, and then they can go and just like inject into their catheter. And then they have to go and find them to say, no, we need that back, mate. We need that back. But yeah, so life could be changing. So, what other projects are you working on?
I mean, I'm sure. Well, nothing certain yet. There's been some talk about starting a video show, but it's not final or anything that I really feel like I can necessarily talk about right now.
Well, like a Satanist one.
Yeah.
Sort of like the atheist experience thing.
That's how I pitched it. I was just like, I want to do that for us.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, so we'll see if that happens. I'm not sure. That's iffy.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I've got my 3 podcasts. I keep the blog going. Over on my Patreon, every once in a while, I'll throw up random fun stuff behind the wall for backers. That's just like, here's something interesting.
Yeah. Does Patreon work for you? Is that a good medium for income generation? I know it's a personal question, but it's something I've often
coming along.
Yeah.
It's coming along. Like it's built up a bit over the last. It's especially gone up over the last few months. I'm hoping that when the documentary is released wide for the Satanic Temple, their Hail Satan documentary, when that comes out, I'm hoping that interest will spur some more growth for me in the blog and stuff. Because I'm the only Satanist on Pathos, and I don't know. It seems like the one thing about the whole Satanism thing is it's drawing this weird line between, you've got theocratic Christians who can't stand what the Satanic Temple is doing because it's Satanist, and then you've got people in the atheist community who don't like Satanism because it's a religion, even though it's non-theistic. And so it's splitting some really weird lines and making interesting conversation. And so I just try and cover it as best I can,
Yeah. Yeah. So what would be your hopes for Satanism, say, going forward?
I don't know if I necessarily have hopes for Satanism. I have hopes that America will find a way to get off of this weird theocracy train that it seems to be heading towards, and get back to a more secular understanding where people can be like, okay, you're this religion, I'm this religion, we're not going to make laws on that at all.
Yeah.
And we're going to get the government back in line, and then I think people can stop being so up each other's ass about what they believe about God,
Damn straight. So,
no worries.
So what do you think would be one of the most, I don't know, hairiest, scariest, most confrontational scenario that you've been in as a Satanist, where you've been, harassed for your beliefs or activism?
it's never been that bad for any of the things that I've done or gone to. I think I happen to live in a place where it's pretty reasonably accepted. Arizona's a weird state because it is the Republicans here are very libertarian, so they tend not to get too hung up on the religious issue stuff. And they say, well, if that's what you want to do, then fine, you can do it. You know, we got that weird Wild West vibe.
Do people know you in the local area then as who you are? And what
I mean, I don't know how ridiculously widely known I am in the net. Well, I did get an article in one of the local papers when I did that thing where I denounced the Catholic Church, but so you know, I don't think I'm widely known. I think people who know who I am know what I'm about.
Yeah. Well,
It's a big city. There's like 6 million.
When you're wearing Satanist t-shirts walking down the street, they can probably guess.
Yeah, but honestly, you know, the Arizona chapter of TST has done so much public outreach stuff, right? Like the Adopt a Highway thing and the tampon collection thing, and all of that makes it in the paper. So when somebody sees an Arizona Satan T-shirt, they're like, "Oh, I know those guys. They seem okay." Like, yeah. For the most part.
Well, wasn't there? I read something about coloring books for kids.
Yeah, that was a while ago. That was a thing that Lucian Grooves did down in Florida, where there was a school. They allowed some Christian group to be distributing Bibles on school property, and so they're like, "Well, then we get to do this too." So they made a coloring book and they sent it down.
Well, what was in the coloring book? Like horned beasts or just unicorns?
No, it was actually really cute, and it was, you know, there was a little maze thing, and they had this, you know, they had like a word scramble, but it was like, you know, be compassionate to one another. It was what the scramble was, or something like that. It was all completely innocuous stuff, except, you know, the little girl character was in robes, and the dog had 3 heads, and but it was cute.
Nice. Cool. Well,
I've got a copy of that already.
Was there anything else you wanted to add about anything sort of either satanic or political, or anything else that you think is relevant to American life at the moment?
Well, I think if I could make any sort of plea, it would be like, if we can just get back to a secular government that's making decisions based on data and reason, then we can move on and get back to doing cool stuff like reading books and making art, which I think is much better. I think we spend so much time talking about this stuff that we don't take the time to enjoy a lot of the good stuff. And I think
how do you do that, though? How would you go about doing that?
How would we go about fixing the government, or how do we go about spending more time
getting a more sort of rational approach to government? Because the way I see it, you know, where Trump has just come out and said, right, we're going to properly repeal everything about Obamacare. So it seems to me that the way that American politics works at the moment is the government gets in for 4 years or 8 years or however long, and then the next government come in and said, right, we are going to completely undo what they've just done, just because that's them and we're us. And it seems to be this completely pointless back and forth that ends up with a net gain. So
well,
I don't know how you stop that.
I think the thing that needs to happen next is, well, regardless of what happens in the presidential election, the conservative right has already packed our judicial system this term.
Oh, yeah.
So the only way to get around the courts, because the courts have their leeway to interpret the law, but if the law that's made can, you know, hem them in and force them to decide based on what the law is. So the only real thing to do now is take over the Senate and increase the majority in the House and start passing a whole lot of left-leaning laws to restrain the problems that we're seeing now in the judicial branch, because we're stuck with this judicial branch for the next 20, 30 years now.
Well, I mean, I remember writing an article on exactly that in fact, your vote for president isn't a vote for president. Your vote for president is a vote for whoever's going to go on the Supreme Court. So you know, and the unfair situation of Obama having 342 days left of his term, and yet they
Oh, it's not just that. There's all these lower court appointments that they blocked for years, right? Yeah. And so when Trump came in, he had something like 150 appointments to fill, and he packed it full of right-wing crazy people who are now doing things like overturning lower court decisions in Kentucky that ultrasound, mandatory ultrasounds for abortion.
Yeah, and those are the things that have more far-reaching ramifications on a daily basis, almost to the general populace. So I think, I think those things are supremely important to get right.
Yeah, but even that's a hard push, right? Like, there's a constitutional civil rights amendment that hasn't been ratified since the 60s because states still won't do it. They tried to ratify it in Arizona this year, and it's still got shot down. And all that's saying is men and women are equal. Why isn't that a constitutional amendment already? It's not.
And then you got Mitch.
But they're so clear. But
you got Mitch McConnell being an absolute douchebag over the last couple of days. I mean, do you know what? Hats off to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because she seems to be coming out and saying the right things. The things she says in Congress or wherever are just spot on. She is eloquent and to the point and nailing it, and Cory Booker as well, and some of these other people. I was wondering what you think about Beto O'Rourke going for president.
I think Beto's pretty good. I actually have a friend who's a comedian in Texas who's campaigning for him now, and he's got a fair amount of good ideas. I really like that he does kind of, like you were talking about Clinton before, going around and basically taking a survey and saying, well, okay, if this is what you guys want. That does seem to be what Beto's doing, where he's actually going out and listening to constituents a lot more than a lot of other people are.
Yeah.
I got to give him that.
Because you've got to go for the middle ground. I mean, you might be a diehard leftist or a diehard rightist, but you know that the diehard Dems are going to always vote Dem, and the diehard Republicans are always going to vote Republicans. So you need those swing voters, and you can almost say anything you like to them to appease them, because you need to get into power. And once you're in power, I mean, it's quite cynical, then you can do what you like, but it's getting that middle ground on board.
Yeah, and you know, just being the president doesn't mean you get to do everything you want to do. You still have to deal with Congress, you still have to deal with state laws, you still have to deal with the judiciary. So,
well, this is what pisses me off so much about Trump, is that he said, I'm going to come in and drain the swamp, and drain the swamp, drain the swamp, drain the swamp. And then he came in and he employed the swamp, and he's covered in the swamp, and he's drowning in the swamp. He's got like 8 Goldman Sachs people advising him, or whatever it was, and you know, and he slagged off Hillary Clinton for that. He slagged her off for the use of different servers, and yet you've got Jared Kushner and everyone else using whatever bloody, you know, servers they want. It's just it's a massive hypocrisy where no one appears to hold him to account, and it's just one lie after the other. But the lie is literally his entire team. You know, he's just surrounded himself with the people he said he would get rid of.
Yeah, no, he absolutely has. Well, he did and he didn't. I mean, when he was talking, that's kind of that weird coded language dog whistle thing. Like when he was talking about the swamp, he was talking about, you know, career politicians who were fighting for social change and that kind of thing. Like, to him, that's the swamp. These people who are getting paid $200,000 a year to try and get more social services put in, you know, when he thinks the people that he think aren't the swamp are like, you know, well, we'll put this coal businessman in charge of, because he values, you know, profit more than anything else.
Yes, which is odd because he went bankrupt so many times and relied on the state to prop him up.
Good at it,
but yeah. There you go. So yes. So anything else you wanted to add before we wrap this bad boy up?
Man, I think the only thing I didn't mention was my second new show is called Live from the Public Domain, where I just read old books at people. So on that show,
what do you mean? You go to like an old person's home and sit there and read them a book?
Yeah, pretty much. I pick stuff from the public domain, so I don't have to pay any royalties on it, and I'm just going to sit and read books. That's my other show. Right now I'm reading The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton on there. Interesting.
So a Christian thinker there. Why choose that book?
Christian thinker, but very funny guy and a great journalist. So I'm not just drawing those weird lines on religion, but the thing about what I like about Chesterton is he's really witty, and that book in particular, he does kind of poke fun at the kind of weird subversive organizations that I tend to hang out with, right? Because the whole thing there is that this anarchist collective is all run by people who are secretly cops trying to bust the anarchist collective, and it becomes a weird, just wraps in on itself in such a delightful way. So, yeah, that's what I'm doing now.
Clearly have an avid interest in books.
Yeah.
In what way? What do you is reading?
Oh, okay. Well, this is actually a thing that is important to me in terms of the atheist and secular community, because there is this overarching push in those groups for science, and I like science, and I love, and you know, I do believe in science and the scientific method and data. But I think that stories and literature, they're the means by which we transfer tacit knowledge without living an experience ourselves, right? And so that, I think, is where really thinking about, you know, morals and ethics and stuff comes from. I think it comes from literature and movies and storytelling far more than it comes, like, you can't, it's the opposite of everything Sam Harris says. We're not going to mathematically decide what's right and wrong. We're going to decide that by empathy and experience through art and literature and knowing people.
Do you find that movies these days put so much more thought into their philosophy, into their messages? Because I watch some movies and I think, wow, there is a great amount of depth here that maybe there wouldn't have been in the 70s and 80s. And I think that there are these layers upon layers. Sometimes even I remember watching Vanilla Sky with Tom Cruise, but I watched the director's cut where the director explained everything, right? And I was like, so when I watch a movie, it was like a 6 out of 10 movie. I watched the director's cut where it explained everything. I was like, that's a 9 out of 10 movie. That's amazing. All that stuff in there. But then I thought,
yeah,
what's the point of putting all that stuff in there if I didn't get it first time, right? But there does seem to be a lot of thought that goes into movies now.
Well, I think I don't know if I think the ratio is probably the same. There's just so much more content, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of really good movies out there, but there's still a lot of, like, just popcorn, this is here for entertainment, and we're not trying to say anything deep movies. I think that those are still there too. So I don't know if necessarily they're I don't know if I think there's more of them, but I think that the ratio is about the same from back when there was less content. You know what I mean?
I suppose some of the sci-fi movies seem to be quite fertile ground for philosophy and for thought.
Yeah.
You can blow apart the normal context of everyday life, and then interject ideas that you wouldn't normally be able to do in a kind of drama, you know, a normal everyday drama. So I think there's maybe those sort of films.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually really excited. What is it? Yeah, 4 days from now, on the 10th, there's going to be a one night only screening of Terry Gilliam's Man of La Mancha, The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, which has taken him years to get made, but Terry Gilliam and Don Quixote, I'm in, right?
Is that a new one of his then?
Yeah.
Wow, because he's had a checkered past of filmmaking.
Sure, but a lot of those movies are brilliant, right?
Well, let me know how it goes.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. So
cool. Well, look, Jack, I have to say it's been an absolute pleasure. We have gone around the houses. We started off with Satanism. We've talked about politics quite a bit, and a little bit about film, and your projects. And I wish you all the very best with all your projects. They sound pretty cool. A lot of reading, and reading is good. Everyone knows reading's good.
yeah.
So I hope this was useful for you, and that people get to know you a little bit better, and get you.
Yeah. This was. Yeah, this was fun, and I hope you're doing well over there, and get well soon, man.
Yeah. I'm out of isolation tomorrow, so I'll be able to wear normal clothes, not hospital white. As you can see, my hair is falling out, so I'm a bit patchy, but you know, it's the new cool.
Yeah, that's fine. That's okay. My hair falls out all the time.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Hey.
Hey. Let's be bold eggs together. Yeah. Anyway, mate, you know, you take it easy. Thank you very much for the interview, and all the best to you and all your projects, mate.
Yeah, same to you, man. Thanks.